The document he was reading wasn't meant for him. That was the thing about working the overnight shift at Hargrove and Pelton's private aviation terminal. People moved through that space as though the staff were furniture. Pleasant, functional, invisible. They set down their briefcases, poured themselves coffee from the service cart, and spoke freely. Too freely, sometimes. As if the man refilling the cream and straightening the periodicals on the side table couldn't possibly understand what they were saying. Most of the time, he couldn't. Or at least, that was what they assumed. Clifton Marsh had worked the private terminal for 11 years. He wore the same dark uniform as the other attendants, navy blue with a small gold pin on the lapel, the kind of pin that meant nothing but looked like it might. He was 53 years old. His hair had gone silver at the temples sometime during his 4th year there, and he'd never bothered to address it. He drove a 2009 Buick with a crack in the passenger side mirror that he kept meaning to fix. He brought his lunch in a blue insulated bag, usually a sandwich, sometimes soup in a thermos, always a piece of whatever fruit was on sale at the grocery near his apartment. He was, by every visible measure, a man who had arrived exactly where he was going. Nobody at the terminal knew that he had once spent 17 years as a senior contract attorney at one of the largest mergers and acquisitions firms in the country. Nobody knew that he had left voluntarily, in the middle of a case that would have made his career, for reasons he'd never fully explained to anyone, including himself. Nobody knew that before he had become a lawyer, he had studied economics and international finance at Georgetown on a full academic scholarship, or that he still read contract law the way other men read the sports page, out of habit, out of pleasure, out of an inability to stop his own mind from working through problems, whether or not anyone had asked him to. Nobody knew, because Clifton had never told them, and because people in his experience saw what they expected to see. The man currently pacing the north alcove of Gate 7, speaking in rapid Mandarin into a phone pressed hard against his ear, expected to see an attendant. So that is what Clifton was. He moved quietly around the perimeter of the room, collected 2 empty glasses from the end table by the window, and continued to the service cart without breaking stride. The man's name was David Reeves. Clifton knew this because Reeves had announced himself loudly to the gate receptionist 40 minutes earlier, the way certain men announced themselves in every room they entered, as though their name were a credential that unlocked better treatment. David Reeves, he had said, of Alderton Capital. He had looked at the receptionist with the expression of a man who expected recognition and was mildly offended when it didn't arrive. Reeves was in his early 40s, well-dressed in the particular way of men who wanted to look effortlessly wealthy and tried slightly too hard at it. He wore a watch that cost more than Clifton's car. He had the kind of tan you got from actual sunlight, not a booth, which meant he spent time somewhere pleasant and had the schedule to do it. He was also, Clifton had determined within the first several minutes of listening, in significant trouble. The Mandarin was fast, but not too fast for Clifton, who had spent 3 years working international trade agreements in the mid-90s and had learned the language out of pragmatic necessity before it had become professionally useful. He hadn't spoken it in some time, but understanding it was a different matter. Understanding had never left. He listened without appearing to listen. It was a skill, the same way folding a napkin properly was a skill, or knowing when to approach a table and when to stay back. Reeves was on the phone with someone he called only brother in the informal address, likely a business partner, possibly an actual relative. He was going over the terms of something he clearly believed to be finalized. The deal was structured around the acquisition of a regional logistics company based in Chengdu. The price point was significant. The timeline was tight, and Reeves was explaining with considerable satisfaction that the liability provisions had been taken care of. Clifton set down the empty glasses and reached for a fresh cloth to wipe down the cart. He had heard that phrase before, taken care of. In his experience, it could mean one of 2 things. Either the provisions had been properly negotiated and both parties were satisfied, or someone had found a way to make those provisions disappear from the conversation before they became an inconvenience. He didn't know yet which of those it was. He went back to the service cart. Eleanor Hatch arrived at Gate 7 at 40 minutes past 10, which was 12 minutes before her flight's posted boarding time, and about 8 minutes before Clifton had expected her, based on the gate sheet he'd glanced at when he came on shift. He recognized her from the quarterly business publication that came to the terminal, the kind of magazine that nobody subscribed to personally, but that appeared regularly in waiting rooms and airport lounges across the country. She had been on the cover about 2 years ago. He remembered it because the headline had been something about redefining logistics infrastructure, which was the kind of language that usually meant the article was going to be dull. But the article itself had actually been interesting. She'd built hatch forwarding from a regional freight operation. Her father had left her into something considerably larger and more complex, and she had done it without the traditional private equity routes, which was unusual enough to be genuinely notable. Eleanor Hatch was 51. She had a runner's posture, the kind that came from actual running and not from self-consciousness. She carried a single bag, good leather, clearly old, the kind of bag that had been bought once and then used for 20 years because it was built to last. She wore minimal jewelry and clothes that were professional without being performative. She moved through the terminal the way people moved through spaces they were comfortable in. Not hurriedly, not slowly, just with a kind of settled confidence. She was, Clifton thought, the kind of person who had stopped needing people to know she was important somewhere around age 45. He recognized the type because he had been trying to become it himself. She sat down in the alcove across from David Reeves, who had by then finished his phone call and was reviewing something on his tablet. He stood when he saw her and offered a handshake that she took with a brisk efficiency that suggested she'd been shaking hands with men like him for 25 years. Clifton moved toward them with the coffee service, professional reflex, partly, mostly something else. "Eleanor," Reeves said, smiling, "I'm glad you could get here early. I was hoping we'd have a moment before the flight." "I didn't realize we needed one," she said. Her voice was even, not unfriendly. "There's a call I'd like us to take together before we land in Chicago. The Chengdu team wants to run through the final terms one more time." He paused. "My interpreter will facilitate. We arranged for her to join remotely." Clifton poured coffee into Eleanor's cup without being asked. Neither of them looked at him. "Fine," Eleanor said. "Is there a problem with the terms?" "No problem," Reeves said. "Just due diligence. You know how they like to revisit things." Clifton returned to the service cart. He was thinking about the phone call he had overheard. He was thinking about the phrase, "taken care of." He was thinking about the specific way Reeves had used the Mandarin term for the liability clause, not the standard term, but a particular colloquial variant that legally meant something slightly but meaningfully different, and that the counterparty in Chengdu would understand in a specific way that Eleanor Hatch almost certainly would not. Because she didn't speak Mandarin, and because her interpreter, if she even had one, would need to know exactly what to listen for. He folded a napkin into the proper shape and placed it on the tray. The thing about liability provisions in cross-border logistics acquisitions was that they determined, ultimately, who paid when something went wrong. And in the freight business, something always eventually went wrong. Reeves had said the provisions were taken care of. The Chengdu team wanted to revisit the final terms. Reeves had his own interpreter facilitating. Eleanor did not appear to have one of her own. Clifton looked at the tray. He looked at the gate door. He looked at the clock on the wall above the service cart, which read 10:52. He picked up the tray and walked back across the room. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He set the small plate of shortbread cookies on the end table beside Eleanor's chair, a standard service touch that nobody ever particularly noticed, and lingered there for a moment longer than he needed to, adjusting the arrangement with the careful attention of a man who took his job seriously. She glanced at him briefly, the way people glanced at furniture when it moved unexpectedly. He met her eyes, just for a moment, just long enough for her to register that he had looked at her deliberately rather than professionally. He went back to the cart. He stood where he always stood, to the side, quiet, available. The call began 12 minutes later. It came through on Reeves's tablet propped on the side table between them. The interpreter appeared on screen, a woman in her mid-30s, professionally dressed, seated in what appeared to be a home office. She introduced herself in English as Vivian. She smiled pleasantly. The Chengdu team consisted of 2 men, both of whom Clifton could see on the screen's divided view. They spoke in measured, formal Mandarin. Vivian translated smoothly into English, and for the first several minutes, nothing was wrong. The conversation covered shipment routing, which was straightforward. It covered the existing client contracts that would transfer with the acquisition, also straightforward. It moved to payment timelines. Still fine. Then the senior man in Chengdu, older, with a directness in his bearing that suggested he was the actual decision-maker and not the one who usually spoke first, made a statement. He said it clearly and without ambiguity, in the formal Mandarin one used for terms that were not open to interpretation. He said that the liability cap for pre-acquisition freight losses would remain fixed at the amount specified in the draft, that the sellers would bear no responsibility for any claims filed after the transfer date, regardless of when the underlying incidents had occurred, that this was a firm position, that it was not negotiable. It was, in Clifton's understanding, a statement that would have made the acquisition considerably more risky for Eleanor Hatch than the current documentation suggested. Vivian translated it as, the sellers were committed to a smooth transition and had agreed to review any outstanding claims on a case-by-case basis in good faith. Clifton set down the cloth he had been using to wipe the service cart. He picked it up again. He set it down. The difference between what had been said and what had been translated was not a language error. It was not a cultural nuance that had been smoothed over for clarity. It was the difference between a liability that would remain with the sellers after closing and a liability that would transfer entirely to Eleanor Hatch from the moment she signed. Reeves was nodding along pleasantly. Of course he was. Clifton walked to the edge of the alcove. He didn't speak. He stood with the professional stillness of a man who was simply present, simply available, in case a cup needed refilling or a napkin needed replacing. Eleanor glanced at him. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. 3. He gave the smallest possible shake of his head. The kind that a person only noticed if they were already looking, and only understood if they were already uncertain. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, just slightly. She looked back at the screen. She said, "Could you ask them to repeat the liability position? I want to make sure I have it exactly," Vivian said pleasantly. "Of course." She turned to the screen. She spoke in Mandarin, but she did not repeat Eleanor's request accurately. She asked the Chengdu team to confirm their commitment to the partnership, which was a different question entirely. The senior man answered accordingly. Vivian translated his answer as confirmation that all terms were as discussed. Reeves made a small, satisfied sound. "There we go," he said. Eleanor sat very still for a moment. She said, "I'd like a 5-minute break." She found him at the service cart. She came directly, without hesitation, which told Clifton that she had made a decision before she stood up from her chair. "You shook your head," she said. "Ma'am," he said. "Don't," she said it without heat. "You shook your head for a reason. I'd like to know what it was." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about 11 years of being furniture. He thought about being seen. "I speak Mandarin," he said. The translation wasn't accurate. She was quiet. She was, he noticed, not surprised, or rather, she was surprised but not disbelieving. There was a difference. Some people, when they heard something that changed the situation, immediately looked for a reason to dismiss it. Eleanor Hatch was not one of those people. She looked like a woman who had spent 25 years making decisions based on information she hadn't expected to receive, and had learned to receive it without wasting time. "How inaccurate?" she asked. "On the liability provisions, significantly." He paused. He was choosing his words with the same care he had once used in deposition rooms. What was said in Mandarin is that the sellers will not bear responsibility for any pre-acquisition claims filed after the transfer date, regardless of when the incident occurred. What was translated said they'd review claims in good faith. Eleanor was quiet for 4 seconds. He counted. "That's not the same," she said. "No." "Is that the only discrepancy?" "It's the only one I caught that mattered." The earlier portions were accurate. She looked toward the alcove. Reeves was on his phone again, turned slightly away, speaking in a low voice. On the service table, the tablet still glowed with the waiting call. "Who are you?" she said. Not unkindly, just precisely. "Clifton Marsh," he said. "I work the overnight shift here." She looked at him for a moment longer than people usually looked at him. "And before that?" He considered the question. "I was a contract attorney, M&A. I left about 11 years ago." She took that in the way she had taken everything else, without visible alarm, without the performance of reaction. "Why are you telling me this?" It was the right question, not the suspicious version, not the skeptical version, but the honest version. Why are you telling me this? What is the cost to you of being wrong, and why are you willing to pay it? Because the translation was wrong, he said, and I was the only one in the room who knew. She went back to the alcove. She sat down. She looked at Reeves and said, in the pleasant and entirely neutral tone of a woman who had negotiated a great many things, "David, I want to bring in my own interpreter for the remainder of the call, just for clarity." Reeves's expression didn't shift much, but something behind it did. "Eleanor, that's not necessary. Vivian is perfectly." "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm sure she is. I'd still like my own. We don't have time to arrange." "I've already arranged it," she said. Clifton, standing at the service cart, did not look at them. He was very carefully polishing a glass that was already clean. What Eleanor had actually done, in the 3.5 minutes she had spent away from the alcove, was call her assistant on her cell phone and explain precisely what she needed. Her assistant had located a certified interpreter, available by video, within 12 minutes. Eleanor had also, in that same window, asked Clifton 3 specific questions about contract structure and liability transfer in cross-border acquisitions, and he had answered them in the direct and technical way he used to answer partner questions at 7 in the morning before a hearing. She had not asked him if he was sure. She had not asked him to explain why she should trust him. She had simply gathered the information she needed and acted on it. He had found this, unexpectedly, moving. The second interpreter joined the call. She was in a different city, unconnected to Reeves or Vivian, and she came recommended by Eleanor's assistant through a firm Eleanor's company had used before. The Chengdu team, to their credit, did not change what they said. They repeated themselves. The senior man restated the liability position with the same clarity he had used the first time. The new interpreter translated it accurately. Reeves said nothing for a moment. He looked at his tablet. He looked at Eleanor. He said, "There may have been some confusion earlier." "There may have been," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. The call concluded 20 minutes later. The liability provision was tabled for renegotiation. Eleanor Hatch did not sign anything on that flight. He was rinsing the coffee service cups when she came back to the cart. Most people at this point would have said thank you and moved on. That was the natural endpoint, the service interaction, the pleasant resolution, the moment where both parties returned to their correct positions in the hierarchy of the space and agreed, by unspoken mutual consent, to let it remain that way. Eleanor set her bag down on the counter beside the cart. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of someone who intended to have a real conversation and needed her hands free. "You said you left M&A 11 years ago," she said. "That's right. You left willingly." "Yes." "Why?" He had been asked this before, by his sister, who had been worried, by his former partner at the firm, who had been baffled, by a therapist he had seen for about 4 months in the first year after, who had asked it in a dozen different ways trying to reach the same answer. He had never given any of them a fully satisfying response, partly because he wasn't sure he had one. He told Eleanor Hatch the version he had told no one, which was the closest version to true. "I was good at it," he said. "That's the honest answer. I was very good at it. And I realized, somewhere around year 15, that being very good at something that didn't matter to you was its own kind of problem. Not a dramatic problem, not the kind people write about, just a quiet one. You wake up one morning and the work you do is work you could do in your sleep, and the money is there, and the status is there, and none of it." He stopped. "None of it lands anywhere." She was quiet for a moment. A gate announcement came over the speaker system. A flight to Houston, not theirs. "And this lands somewhere," she said, not sarcastically, as a genuine question. He considered it. "Some nights," he said, "not always." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, not pity, not condescension, something more like recognition. "I'm redoing the logistics contracts for the Chengdu acquisition," she said, "if it proceeds, which now depends on renegotiation. The firm I use for M&A work is based in New York, but they subcontract a lot of the cross-border liability review." She paused. "I'd want someone who reads Mandarin contract language and knows how liability provisions work in acquisition structures." Clifton set down the cup he was holding. "I don't have a license anymore," he said. "I let it lapse. I'd need to be reinstated. How long would that take?" He had looked it up once, out of curiosity, or something that resembled it. "Several months, maybe less, depending." "I'm not in a hurry," Eleanor said. "The Chengdu deal won't close before summer at the earliest, the way things are looking. He looked at his hands. He looked at the service cart, the clean cups in a row, the folded napkins, the small plate of shortbread that nobody had touched. "Why would you trust me?" he said. "You don't know me." "I know you noticed something that would have cost me considerably," she said. "And I know you told me about it when you had no reason to. And I know you answered 3 very specific legal questions in about 90 seconds with the kind of precision that doesn't come from reading." "That's not nothing. It's not a reference," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's better. It's evidence." He thought about it on the drive home that morning, the way the city was just beginning to pull itself into wakefulness around him. Delivery trucks and early joggers, and the particular gray-pink light that sat over the skyline before the sun fully committed. He drove the 2009 Buick and thought about liability provisions and reactivated licenses, and a woman who had received information she hadn't expected and acted on it without wasting time. He thought about the 17 years at the firm, which had been real. The competence had been real. The skill had been real. The friendships with certain colleagues had been real. What hadn't been real, or hadn't been enough, was the sense that any of it mattered in a direction that had anything to do with him, that it connected to something he could follow backward to his own center. He had spent 11 years becoming invisible. He wasn't sure when he had started whether that was grief or rest. Probably both. Probably the thing he had needed was to stop performing competence for people who would never see past it to him. And the only way he had known how to do that was to remove himself from any space where competence was visible. It had worked. For a long time, it had worked very well. He parked the car in the lot behind his building. He sat in it for a moment with the engine off. Through the cracked passenger mirror, the sky was coming up copper and pale blue in bands. The woman in the private terminal had looked at him and asked why he was telling her. Not with suspicion. With genuine curiosity. Not "Who are you that I should believe you?" but "Who are you that you would say this at all?" He had answered her honestly, because the translation was wrong and I was the only one in the room who knew. That was the whole of it. That was the reason. Not ambition. Not the desire to return to something. Just the simple, unglamorous fact that a thing had been wrong, and he had known it, and saying nothing had not been possible once he understood what was at stake. He got out of the car. He went upstairs. He made coffee and sat by the window and watched the city come fully awake, and he thought about whether the version of himself that had folded napkins for 11 years, and the version that had argued liability provisions in conference rooms at major firms were actually different versions, or just the same man in different light. He thought they might be the same man. He thought that might be, at long last, okay. He found the phone number for the State Bar's reinstatement office in the afternoon when he woke up. He sat with it for a moment. Then he dialed. The woman who answered was brisk and efficient, and told him the process in the manner of someone who had explained it many times, and would explain it many more. He took notes in the margin of a grocery receipt he found on the kitchen counter. The estimate, she said, was 4 to 6 months depending on caseload. "All right," Clifton said, "I'd like to begin." He hung up and looked at the grocery receipt. He looked at the phone. Through the window, the afternoon had turned the particular shade of gold. It turned in that apartment at that hour, when the light came in at the right angle and made ordinary things look briefly like they were lit from inside. He thought of a private terminal on the north side of the city, and a woman who had said, "That's not nothing. It's better. It's evidence." He had been evidence once, of something careful and serious and willing to pay attention when it mattered. He had been that, and then he had disappeared into the background of other people's moments. And now someone had looked at the background and found him still there. He folded the grocery receipt and put it in his pocket. He wasn't sure what came next. He didn't need to be. There was a process now, and a timeline, and a phone number he had dialed, and somewhere in the months between this afternoon and summer, a contract in need of someone who understood both the language and the architecture of what it was trying to say. It would be enough. For now, it was more than enough. It was a beginning.